Hey folks, this is Dr. Josh Packard. I'm the Executive Director of Springtide Research Institute, and I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. The entire team at Springtide is just thrilled to be able to host this, incredibly important conversation about faith, mental health, religion, spirituality. And I want to start by acknowledging our co-host organizations who will be hosting these breakout rooms after the first part of the presentation. The Muslim Wellness Foundation is here, CLAL is here, the National Federation of Catholic Youth Ministry, as well as Fuller Youth Institute. And one of the things that we want to do at this conference is help you move from an idea to action here in just 90 minutes. And we know that theologies, belief systems, religious traditions, schools of thought, like this is a critical part of taking informed action on behalf of young people and mental health through the lens of faith and religion and spirituality. We also know that that is not our lane at Springtide. That is not what we do best. When we speak prescriptively, we do so from the social sciences. And so we need to have these kinds of thought partners who are willing to come alongside and host that part of the conversation. And we couldn't have a better set of organizations to do that. And I just want to say thank you and encourage you to continue this first part of the conversation in those breakout rooms later. As I've had the amazing opportunity over the last few years since starting Springtide to travel around and talk with people who work with young folks, it became very clear that this topic, mental health, was top of mind for just about everyone. And at Springtide, then we had to figure out, is there a place for us in this conversation? What, if anything, can we contribute to this conversation that would be useful and not just adding to the noise? I mean, nobody needs us to tell them that there's a mental health crisis among young people. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the Children's Hospital Association, and even the U.S. Surgeon General's office has all done that work already. So in our work about mental health, we want to stay right in our lane as a sociological research institute. Instead of getting to things like diagnosis and treatment, we're focusing on how you can create mental health friendly organizations that support young people's overall mental health. And faith, purpose, and religion play a super important role in all of that. And we want to show you exactly how those things come together today. All right, so we'll be walking through some of the highlights of our newest study here in a second, but just before we get to that, I want to say, if you're joining us live today, or if you're watching the recording, please note that we have over 2,000 people registered from a wide variety of cultural, religious, and other backgrounds. You may encounter language that doesn't, always reflect your own faith tradition, your own religious background. Even words like faith and spirituality are not things that cut across the board. They don't all mean the same thing to everyone. We just ask for your patience and understanding that our heart at Springtide is to try and understand and support all young people and the adults who work with them. We're working very hard to try and communicate our findings clearly and specifically while being as inclusive as we possibly can. So if you have to do some translation work or some filtering work, please do that and know that our hearts are with you in that work. And if you need anything clarified, please be in touch with us and we can try and clarify. The report that I mentioned that has come out this week, which will inform the part of this report, or the part of this webinar, is called The State of Religion in Young People. We've been doing this every fall for the last couple of years, since 2020. And the focus, of course, this year is on mental health. If this is of interest to you, I strongly encourage you to get the entire report. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Springtide Research Institute is solely dedicated to 13 to 25-year-olds, commonly referred to as Gen Z. And we're focused on that part where their religion, their spirituality, their faith comes into contact with their daily lives. The second thing that's really important to know about us is that we're an applied research institute, which means that we're trying to do work that is useful as opposed to being merely interesting. And we do this in a very specific way. We collect all of our data through the process that we call data with heart. And we have a lot of data. I mean, even just for this report, we collected 9,837 surveys using a nationally representative sample of young people. And we did 105 in-depth interviews. But we are not unbiased. We have a pretty clear agenda here. And that agenda is to see young people flourish. And we firmly believe that in order for young people to flourish, their faith and their spiritual religious lives have to be well attended to. And so that's what we try to do. We try to gather information in a scientific way that allows for young people to flourish in all aspects of their life. But really importantly, in this data with heart component, we don't just collect data, we're also structurally listening to young people throughout our entire research process. So we have a young person's advisory board. You're going to hear from some of them later that meet with us monthly that help us to understand what questions and avenues and things we might pursue. This very project comes out of a comment that a young person made during one of those meetings and sparked this entire line of inquiry for us. We take findings back to them. Sometimes they help us to interpret them, and then we triangulate. I mean, we're still researchers, right? So just because a young person says it doesn't mean we report it. We're still looking to theory and data, as well as things like our advisory board, our podcast. We have a writer in residence, interns, lots of ways that young people are a part of this process that make up this data with heart approach. So with all that in mind, what have we been learning about young people? Well, let's start with a couple of big things. I mean, first, it's important to note that their religious and spiritual lives are very important to them, but they're not, they don't show up in very traditional ways. I know this decline narrative, well established, young people in general and people overall are not attending worship services as often as they used to across the board. They're not affiliating, meaning when they ask them to check the box, they don't like to check the box. And that's not untrue, but it's not the whole story. We consistently see pretty massive curiosity and exploration among 13 to 25-year-olds, but their engagement just doesn't look like it used to for a variety of reasons. So just as we've been tracking this, here's what we see over the last few years. I mean, coming through, during the pandemic and now coming out of it, we see some pretty stable numbers about those who identify as religious or spiritual. We think the data that we've collected over the past few years shows that institutions may need to rethink how they're engaging with young people, but also we believe that current institutions and the new ones that people are building to do that engagement will be essential for the long-term religious and spiritual flourishing of young folks. So while we see these numbers remaining relatively stable right now, we shouldn't just take them for granted and think, well, oh, so 3/4 of young people will always identify as religious or spiritual. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I just mean to show this right now as like, this maybe doesn't fallen off of the cliff that a lot of people think that it has. There's still massive opportunity out there to engage young folks in these conversations. But it does not look maybe like you might have thought it did or does and maybe once did. When we ask young folks, and when we look under those overall numbers, you'll see that like 3/4 are telling us that they're religious or spiritual, but only 65% of young people are attending religious services once a year or less. And that includes some who are attending, a big chunk there who are attending never. And only about 1/3 are about what you might call regular attenders. So their religion and spirituality takes a much different form than it has in previous generations. Again, we see the picture here diversifying even more. When we ask them, how much connected do you feel to these various expressions or entities? 42% say they're moderately or highly connected to a higher power, but that's about the same number as feel connected to all of humanity. And it's a much bigger number that say that they feel connected to the natural environment. Now, these are not mutually exclusive, right? I mean, you could be connected to all three, to any combination of the two of them. But what we see is, I think what we're looking at when we see these numbers is not a rejection of God or gods, but rather another piece of evidence that their religious explorations take a variety of different forms. The world was never as homogeneous as a lot of people like to think that it was. And that diversity is only accelerating with this newest generation. We can take one more piece of evidence to look at that here. We've been asking young people, what do you actually do if you're not attending, if you don't affiliate, you don't identify that way? What do you actually do that is making up this religion or spirituality that you're a part of? And just picked a few to share right here. So you see that prayer, nearly half of young people are saying that they pray daily or more often, weekly rather, or more often. But you also see art and being in nature rise up there as well. And we just picked a few. There are more of these that we've been tracking. In fact, we wrote an article in Religion News Service about a year ago, noting the number of young people who are thinking of acts of protest as religious and spiritual practice. And so they're engaging and exploring the contours and boundaries of what religion and spirituality look like and mean to them, but not always doing it in these very institutional ways. Secondly, then, we want to note that Gen Z is also in the middle of the biggest mental health crisis that we've ever seen. So just as much as young people are sort of losing touch, as they're losing touch with these institutions, they're also dealing with this mental health crisis. So a lot of the people who might have been well positioned to support them through the lens of faith and religion are not necessarily super connected to them anymore. You see these numbers here, about half of young people talking about, that they're moderately or extremely stressed, anxious, depressed, lonely. Now, these are self-report numbers. I want to be really clear. These are not clinical diagnoses. But when we combine these data with what we're seeing from our clinical colleagues in psychology, psychiatry, counseling, and along with what I'm sure you're seeing anecdotally in your own lives, maybe even with your own children, well, we see that something really important is going on with the mental health of young people today. The pandemic, of course, was no friend here in this situation. As we asked young people, what has been the biggest challenge for you? We had tracked this over the course of 3 surveys right at the beginning, 1 year in this previous March at the 2-year mark. And young people said that their mental health was the biggest challenge that they had during the pandemic. The second one there, being alone, is very closely related to that. And you see both of these trump the fear of getting sick, which comes in a fairly distant third from mental health. In fact, mental health issues, were at play here for this generation long before the pandemic even started. Unfortunately, this reality is often hidden from the adults in their lives who don't fully see or have a chance to understand them. I'm going to bring Marta Abawaji, our head of community engagement, on to share more about this. Marta, thanks for being here.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be connecting with everyone right now. One of the most exciting parts of my job is getting to connect with our Springtide ambassadors. They're young people spread all throughout the country, and I get to connect with them as well as other podcast guests and a number of different young people. And what they are repeatedly telling us is that while they want to talk to the trusted adults in their lives about their mental health experiences, they sense that those adults have some trepidation to actually have these conversations, that, it's just that the adults don't always feel comfortable. So they're more talking sometimes to their peers. But we asked our ambassadors, as well as other young people that we're in conversation with, what do you wish that you could tell the adults in your life about your mental health? What do you wish they understood about your mental health experiences? So we have 5 voices we want you to hear right now answering that exact question.
Something that I wish that the adults in my life understood about mental health is that it comes and goes in waves. Just because I struggle with a certain thing doesn't mean that I'm gonna display that 100% of the time. Do you know what I mean? So if I struggle with depression or something like that, it doesn't mean I'm gonna be super sad all the time. It can last for a day or 2 or a few weeks, or cycle through months or seasons. So I wish that they understood that. Another thing that I wish that they understood is that I kind of, oh God, I kind of suppress it myself. So when I want to act like I'm fine, minor things tend to set me off, if that makes sense. So it's not really that I'm freaking out or that really small things trigger me. That's not it. It's just that it's an accumulation of things, and they kind of build up until very minor inconveniences happen, and that's kind of what sets me off. So yeah.
The one thing I would like adults to understand about mental health is that sometimes it's okay to be sad and to not have a direct, concrete reason. I think I experienced this a lot, trying to explain away my sadness to not be sad anymore. And I realized that we never do this when we're happy. We never, when we're just having a day where we feel happy or joyful, we don't sit there and think, why am I happy? What are the reasons? Sometimes you just are, and you just feel it. Maybe it's the energy in the room, or maybe it is something that happened in particular, but we often don't try to explain away our happiness. In the same strain, I think when we're sad, we try to explain it away so we don't have to feel pain or sadness or grief, and we say, well, it's not that bad, or it could be worse, or things like that. And I think it's important sometimes to sit in sadness, because in the world there are really beautiful, wonderful things that make us happy. And there are also really sad and terrible and horrible things that happen that can make us sad.
The society we're living in now, I feel is a lot more complex, a lot more fast-paced, and a lot more divided than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And I think this adds an immense amount of stress to our lives that it can be hard to navigate sometimes. And there's so much information that is passed down from social media and spread from the social or the media outlets that it can be hard to differentiate what's right and what's wrong. And I think that when it comes to deciding what's best for my mental health, it can be very hard to make the correct decision.
The biggest thing that I wish adults, I'm an adult, so I guess what I mean, the biggest thing that I wish people in leadership or authority positions over me understood about mental health is that you don't actually need to be in a crisis to need help. Mental health is extremely valuable and important, and it's something that we should all be honoring and protecting in our daily lives. So that would be my biggest point.
I wish the adults in my life knew just how meaningful it was, how meaningful it is that I have them to talk to, even if it's just the little things, that I have someone, not only professionals, but also adults in my family life and things like that, to talk to, just so that I know that I can heal and be myself with them by my side and with support. I know that I can trust them, and that is incredibly important to me.
We're so honored to have Mercer and Sophia and Jake and Fardosa and Jasper's voices really in conversation with the data today. We have a lot of voices beyond those 5 that you just heard that we feature in our podcast. We have what is called the Voices of Young People podcast, and we have season 7. It's available now. There are 16 different young people that are featured in this mental health and Gen Z season. And you get to go even deeper than some of those reflections you just heard on what experiences young people are having with mental health, what conversations they're having in their schools or workplaces, and really what they wish adults understood and ways that they could feel and dig into what our Springtide ambassadors, as well as other youth and young adults that we're in conversation with, what they're telling us about mental health. Thanks.
Marta, thank you so much. I mean, I think one of the things that's really important about getting to hear those voices, as well as the podcast here, is that one of the things that we hear pretty clearly coming through from Gen Z is that there's no stigma, or not that there's no stigma, I guess that's an overstatement, but the stigma of talking about mental health to each other is not nearly as prevalent in their lives as the stigma that they sense in talking to the adults in their lives. In other words, like, they're relatively comfortable with this conversation, especially with each other, but they know that it weirds out the adults in their lives to be having these kinds of talks. And so when adults make the make the initiative to open up these lines of communication, it can be really, really powerful. And so that's one of the things we want to do, is like, how do we begin to open up these lines of communication? Well, when I mentioned that at Springtide we're sociological, what that means is that we really focus on structures more than individual personalities. We want to help you to think about, how can you create an organization that is mental health positive? What, in this case, what can synagogues, mosques, and churches do to create environments where mental health doesn't just mean mental illness, right? So we've been focusing our energy and time at Springtide over the last year on exactly this particular issue. And it turns out that there are some things that we can do to help our organizations foster the flourishing of young people through a lens of faith and religion and spirituality, and for their overall mental health. I want to really stress, though, that this does not take the place of doing the really important work to have, like, mental health first aid training and to connect with real professionals who work in the mental health fields in your communities to be a resource for the young people in your life. Those are essential. But I saw firsthand as an educator for 15 years before coming to Springtide just how prevalent these issues are, and it's too important to just sit around and wait for a crisis to respond to. I think we can be more proactive. And I think that a lot of this research here around connections, expectations, and purpose inside of our organizations helps us to do that, helps us to get young people to see that they are a part of a story that's bigger than just themselves, to get them to see that there's an important role for them to play in this world. And that kind of work is critical. It's work that really only, that you can do. You're particularly well suited to do this. So these are the three components that make up these mental health positive organizations. We're going to walk through each of these just in brief so we can get a better sense of them. Connection is really about belonging. It talks about this refers to the depth and number and type of relationships that a person has. They don't all have to be these like super deep relationships, but a lot of times, as we've been following this work over the number of years, young people don't feel like they have any relationships. I mean, it's something like a third of young people have one or fewer trusted adult in their life that they feel like they can talk to. And as we know from lots of good family development, child adolescent research, as well as sociologists and social psychologists, the magic number seems to be somewhere around 5. We really want to get young people connected to 5 trusted adults. So creating more belonging inside of our organizations with young people really starts to fill this gap where young folks start to feel like they are not alone and not all by themselves. So what does this feel like when young people talk about it? Well, they feel like they don't have to hide who they are. This is the kind of words that they use. They feel that they are cared about and that they feel safe. These are some of the core components. If you're really interested in digging into this, of course, there's lots of free resources on our site and YouTube and others where you can hear us talk about the notice, name, known process of creating belonging inside of your org. But suffice it to say, these connections are absolutely vital for young folks so that they don't feel like they're going through these struggles alone. Is great. And they'll tell you all the time, like as great as social media is, it doesn't replace the need for in real life connections, but sometimes they just don't know how to do it. And so really making that the focus of our organizations can go a very long way. Marta mentioned our ambassadors. I mentioned already, but that we really like to make sure that we are being actionable, not just interesting. We want to be useful in your lives. And so we've got these tide turning tips that come right from our ambassadors that we sort of listened to them, looked at where they might align with the data, and then created these kinds of resources throughout this work and other work where you can begin to see some concrete things that you can take right now. And so you see this one, what the ambassadors told us: when adults notice that you aren't not just physically gone, but if they notice that you aren't being yourself, if you're kind of withdrawn, it's so significant to have them notice that too. And then the tip that comes out of this is to make a plan, an actual plan with your team of faith leaders and volunteers for how you might reach out to young people when they seem overwhelmed, withdrawn, or not quite themselves. Now, of course, all of this is predicated upon the idea that you know young people well enough to know when they are not being themselves. And there's a variety of ways to do that. I'm sure that that you've got many in mind already, but systematizing that, being able to share that information across a team of people so that we can begin to sort of really know when somebody seems off and where we might be able to step in. Young people here, in their own words, are telling you how important that is. But we've got more than that, and I'm going to bring on one more guest here from Springtide. This is Dr. Angela Patterson. She's our head of writing and editing. Angela, thanks so much for being here, because I know that you've helped to create this resource, because what we know is that there's more, like this is an immediate actionable nugget that's right, that's here right on the screen, but we know that this work is not, we don't want to make light of how important and serious this is. Some people want to go deeper.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of information in these reports, as Josh has alluded to, and we're all about being able to have actionable insights here at Springtide. So we have devised a guide to help you move from the ideation stage to actual aligned action. Just like you heard the voices earlier in our presentation, this guide allows you to hear from the voices in your own context and in your own service areas about how you can build mental health friendly organizations. So this guide is just a 20-page workbook that has 3 distinct sections that you can work through yourself as an individual, or if you have groups within your organization, it also serves that purpose to help you get aligned as a workforce, as a staff, as a volunteer force around how to optimize your organization for mental health for young people. So it has an opportunity for you to self-reflect. to take our data points and actually drill down systematically and how you might be able to incorporate those in where you have your service with young people, and also how to incorporate the connection and expectation and purposes framework that Josh is going through right now, to see how you might be able to integrate that into your own system that you already have working. We're really proud of this guide. We think it's right in alignment with what we do, and that is to help you serve young people as best you can in this environment. So we hope that you'll check it out.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. I mean, one of the things that is really true about the work that we do is like, I think obviously I'm the executive director here. I think the research is really important and is really applicable. But the reality is that when we collect data at a national level, it might open up or inform a conversation that people are having, or ideally sort of influence some of the work that they're doing when they're trying to make a decision about where to spend resources. But that reality is that, you know, your boots on the ground are going to look different. They're going to reflect your local circumstances. And I think one of the really great things that we can do at Springtide when we're doing our work well is that it helps you to know if what you're seeing in your local context is just because you've got, you know, a group of kids that are, you know, a little weird, or if you've got a group of young people that are reflecting these kind of national trends and how you might respond to it. So even these workbooks are not like prescriptive in the sense of like, you know, do X, do Y, do Z, and then magically spits out these flourishing young people on the other end. They're really reflection exercises to get you to be in conversation with your local context and what we are seeing at a national level, both of which make up what I think, you know, is should inform good course of action with young folks, because we recognize that, you know, at some point our expertise, you know, it runs out, and it runs out at exactly that moment when we start digging down into the suburbs of Des Moines or something, wherever your, you know, particular setting and context is. So we want to support and be a part of the solutions that you all are trying to craft on the ground, and this is just one way that we can help you to go deeper. So we talked about connections, and connection is really about belonging. Well, this expectations one is a little bit weird, right? I mean, what are we talking about with expectations? I mean, I think a lot of people would think about Gen Z and expectations, and maybe we would bring some of the biases that we have about young people to the conversation and think that, oh, we have to lower our expectations so that way they'll, you know, engage with us. And you know, I'll be honest, that was actually a part of the hypotheses that we had too about young people. They just want everything to be easier. And as it turns out, that wasn't at all the case. Now, look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that all young people want to be challenged all the time to do the hardest possible thing in their lives. I mean, a lot of times they like to play video games. I mean, so do I, for that matter. But what they were telling us was that in those places where, you know, we have any expectations, and they can be high, they can be low, they can be default, they can be stated explicitly or whatever, is really about alignment between those expectations and the tools that they feel like they have to meet those expectations. So, you know, when we think about these like social narratives of what you're supposed to be in life and what you're supposed to do, sometimes, you know, in some settings they're very clear. In the spring, we released our first report in this series, which was for educators, and you know, in many respects, the expectations for schools are pretty clear. Students knew them; they're like supposed to get good grades and succeed academically, et cetera, et cetera. And the mismatch between, if there was any, between tools was like, well, they don't feel like they have the right academic tools to succeed academically. For religious settings, this is much different, right? Sometimes even our default assumptions about how young people move through, you know, what we might call broadly sort of religious or spiritual formation, they're based on a timeline or a set of ideas that don't always, you know, match young people's realities. So let me give you one example that's like really specifically related to mental health. This was the quote that I said kicked off this entire series for us. This is from one of our ambassadors, and it really triggered this way of thinking in my own head. And he said, the time I went with my youth leader with mental health concerns, I was told to pray about it, but that didn't solve anything. When that didn't work, I thought, well, not only does my mental health suck, but my faith life sucks too. You see, so there's an example of like a mismatch between expectations and tools. And this is not to suggest that prayer is a bad tool. It's just it's bad if that's the only tool that you have when you're also trying to deal with mental health. And as this young man explained this to us, then the others in this very diverse group all started chiming in with other stories of like, oh yeah, like this is not a conversation that we feel like we can even have in religious spaces for a variety of reasons. And one of those like core reasons centered around how open or willing they felt like the adults in their faith spaces, their religious spaces, were to conversations and questions. And I think a lot of times what happens is that we see as adults, we tend to see conversation or the desire for conversation or a question as a challenge, as it's sort of like chipping away at the foundation of what, like, we're trying to give you a tool. Like, if you believe in this set of things, your life will be better, I promise you. And then we see conversations or questions as like a challenge to that, and we want to guard against it. But really, your ability to host conversations, your ability to engage young people in questions, make space for those questions, have questions of your own, those are the tools that young people need today. And so when they talk about what good expectation alignment looks like, they're referring to these tools a lot. And you'll see though that not everybody feels like they can get them. In the tide turning tip, then we see this come right back up. They said, this one young person said, I once attended a youth group that was lots of fun, but there wasn't a lot of room to question what the youth group leaders would say. It bothered me not to be able to ask a lot of questions. Something I grew to appreciate about my own church, where my mom was the leader, was something she often said while preaching, and I think this is so beautiful. Great is the mystery of faith. There was a sense that if you get to lean into the mystery of God, it would open up the chance for young people to ask questions. And so expectations around the importance of certainty and doubt are pervasive in religious communities. I mean, they should be. This is what we're doing with young people in their religion, is we're setting expectations for them, we're showing them a way. But seeking answers and leaning into mystery can both be holy activities for young people, especially as they navigate some of life's biggest questions. In fact, this is a generation that, in part because of their institutional disconnection, they're actually more skeptical if they see a sort of completely packaged answer being offered over to them. We've covered this in previous reports. And one of the best things then that a role model of faith can do is to practice saying, well, I'm not sure about the answer to that question. Let's find out together. Now, we're not encouraging you to lie. I mean, if you're sure, say that you're sure, but or maybe don't say that you're not sure. At the very least, you might call back to when you did feel like you weren't sure, and remind the young person that you're talking to of what that might have looked like. In the very first State of Religion and Young People report, we wrote about relational authority. What is the best way to get, influence in a young person's life? And it was this combination of expertise. It's the fact that you knew something that was really important. But there was this whole other set of things that needed to go along with it too, is listening, integrity, transparency, and care. And you see that very first one, which is the most important, which is listening. Are you willing to sit and listen to a young person's questions on their timeline, not yours? And are you willing to take them seriously and not try to solve all of their problems, but to probe and go deeper and have conversations? These are the tools that young people need. I think that these actually exist in a lot of traditions that I'm aware of, not in all expressions, I understand, but there are places where we can invite in more conversation and questioning. And those are the kinds of actual tools, these are not challenges, actual tools that young people say reduces the cognitive dissonance in their lives and lets them see an organization as supporting of their mental health, as creating space for them to flourish, and not just one more set of expectations that they don't feel like they can live up to, and therefore creating even more of the sort of stress and distress in their lives that they're already feeling like they're dealing with. The last one, though, I mean, this is, so this is sort of your bread and butter. This is where religious groups should thrive, and we got to create a sense of purpose. A pastor a couple of years ago asked me, and they said, how can we get young people back to church? And I was like, oh, that's really the wrong question to be asking. Maybe 20 years ago, that was the right question, but this is a generation that's not really growing up in church for the most part. When I say church, I mean religious communities broadly. We're seeing them disengage from institutional forms of religion all over the place. Now, what that has meant, we're not here to say whether that's good or bad, but we know what the consequences are. And the consequences are that they are often then disconnected from the structures that might have automatically helped them to discover a sense of purpose in their lives. And so while we see that, it's 66% of young people say that they live their life with young people say they live their life with a sense of purpose. I'm not really sure if that's a big, if that's a good number or bad. I mean, still 34% feels like a lot to be wandering around the world, not living their life with a sense of purpose. But that, even for the 66%, that isn't necessarily coming through religious and spiritual practices. So 87% of young people told us that religious and spiritual practices do not necessarily lead to a sense of purpose. But, and here's the really critical but, I think that is mostly reflective of the fact that they're not structurally engaged in those institutions and to the extent that they used to be. So let's take a look at what they said did help them. What experiences have helped you to discover your sense of purpose? You could click all that apply here. And you see the number one thing that young people said as being helpful to them: asking questions and seeking information about things that matter to me. The second one, experiencing trauma, hardship, or illness, either of my own or someone I care about. Nobody's suggesting that you create trauma for young people so that they can discover a sense of purpose. But these things begin to point the way that we might be able to, to intervene and to support them and to help them, to engage them, so that as they're going through the, inevitably life is full of trauma, hardship, and illness at various times, we can be there to support them, and we can be there to do so in a way that reflects the values and learnings from our own faith traditions and bring those things into concert with one another. You see, following beliefs that I was taught about how to treat others, our heads might automatically jump to some sort of religious system here, but I don't think that's quite what's being expressed necessarily in this variable. I'll get to the religious ones in just a second. Creating for and supporting people in my life. Then you see music and art coming back up again, and on and on. You see there's a whole bunch of stuff there. It's on the next slide, actually, that we get to the religious ones. So 16% said that knowledge they have about a religion's understanding of God or a higher power helped them to discover purpose. Experiences of God's presence, belonging to a religious or spiritual community, nothing, and then participating in religious or spiritual practices. So this is not, I think we're seeing here is not so much an understanding that religion doesn't matter to them. It's that they don't see those places and they don't see those people right now as helping them to do that particular work of discovering their sense of purpose in life. I don't see the mismatch here, though, that I think these data might, because I understand that the things that we're capable of doing in our religious and spiritual settings often can align with the things that are at the top of this chart. It's just that maybe we were operating under some, I don't know, maybe some older information or some, systems that don't set us up very well to be able to do that work that's on the top of this list. How much do we really make space for young people to be able to engage in music and art on their terms, the kind of music and art that they care about in our settings? We've already talked about, how much do they really deal with, questions in those formal religious settings. And even experiencing trauma, hardship, or illness. I mean, sort of what makes me really sad, and I feel like all too often, is a lot of times adults dismissing what young people are calling trauma and sadness and hardship in their lives, and adults with the benefit of a lot more perspective are saying, like, that's not really trauma, you're just calling it trauma. And young people told us in interviews, and anecdotally they say, when that happens to them, it just becomes like they just lose so much trust and respect for the adults who are making those claims in their lives. And so not only can we be better about responding to that language, I think, when it happens, but I think we can actually, within our traditions, while keeping them intact, I think we can begin to reformulate the ways that we engage with Gen Z around these kinds of things. We think we know what it means to care for and support people in their life. I mean, I grew up in the generation where we sent lots and lots of, good, suburban Christians on mission trips to other places. But I'm not so sure, after listening to Gen Z, that that's what care and support of the people in their life looks like for them. And I think that we might do well to radically rethink what caring and support looks like, and to be able to support them in the ways that they want to do that. So I think we can do all of these things while doing these things here, and make those two parts of the list come much more in line with one another. So those are the basic outlines there. Religious and spiritual leaders and guides have all the tools that they need to play a vital role in young people's lives at this critical moment, especially at this intersection of faith and mental health. You know how to help young people get connected. You have the tools to help them thrive, and you have the traditions and bodies of knowledge going back centuries, in many cases, that can help them discover purpose in life. In fact, I would argue, like, nobody's more well-suited to do this work than you. The more we can bring these three things together inside of our organizations, the more that we'll see young people thriving, the more that they'll begin to feel like that is a place where they are taken care of. And I don't want to get too much like, look, we're going to have a revival and young people are going to come back to synagogues en masse on Friday nights and back to church youth groups on Wednesdays, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I mean, I think we're in for a radical reshaping and a rethinking of what these institutions look like. they're not going to necessarily look like they used to, but they can be just as important in the lives of young people. We are big believers at Springtide in the importance of institutions. We don't see long-term coordinated, sustained, behavior from people that isn't institutionally supported and connected in some way. We are not saying burn it down, but we're very realistic too about where these data trends are taking us. And we feel like this is a moment, and this is a particular issue around which if the church and the church broadly speaking, religious organizations, religious leaders, spiritual leaders, broadly speaking, do not respond effectively to, then we're going to miss a real opportunity here to help young people flourish in all parts of their lives. So in order to help us dig a little bit deeper into this key moment in history as we emerge from a pandemic and deal with the influence of new forms of media and communication, we face social issues some of us could have never even imagined as recently as like 10 or 15 years ago. I'd like to introduce Serena Bean to join me. Serena, if you would go ahead. There you go. Look at that. That's perfect. Serena is, just so impressive. She's the project co-lead for Loneliness and Connection at the Office of the U.S. Surgeon General. She's in training to become I'm sorry, not a religious leader. What? No, what's the term?
Hospital chaplain.
Thank you, chaplain. I was going to say cleric. I'm like, that's not right. The training to become a chaplain. But generally speaking, I mean, the best way that I've found to like sort of sum up what Serena is in the world is that she is the person who makes you think that you were really lazy in your 20s. Her bio is just super impressive. And in addition to all of these roles that she plays and all the stuff that she does, she's also on our advisory board. We've benefited greatly from her expertise here. And so, Serena, thank you so much for joining us. It's been these conversations leading up to this for me have been super useful, and I'm excited to get to dig into this a little bit with you today.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh.
Okay, so as I mentioned, you're currently the project co-lead or working with the Surgeon General on issues of loneliness and isolation. Can you describe your work there and help us to understand why the Office of the Surgeon General is interested in these things? I mean, this feels like a sort of a left turn for that office. I mean, when I was growing up, the Surgeon General was telling me not to smoke, and now is interested in like loneliness and isolation.
Absolutely. And I'll start off by saying that we at the Office of the Surgeon General, our team comprised of people from many different faith backgrounds. And firstly, we just see, admire, and appreciate the role that faith leaders play in creating mentally healthy environments for our young people. And I'm going to answer your question, Josh, but I also want to begin by sharing a little bit about what the Surgeon General does. I know the name can be a bit misleading at times. We often get questions like, are they a surgeon, or are they more like an army general? So the Surgeon General is known as the nation's doctor, and it's a position elected by the president with responsibilities to provide Americans with the best scientific information on how we improve our health. And our office's role within the broader government structures is to call national attention to the most urgent public health crises of our time. We do this through different reports that we author, through public health campaigns that we launch, but really trying to say the right thing at the right time with the right people, such that we can really help spark public health movements that change the course of our country's understanding of health. So back to your question, Josh, you were pointing to the fact that historically the Surgeon General has focused on issues more traditional, such as cigarettes and opioids. Yet our current Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, has really pointed to mental health and emotional well-being as the priorities for our office and for the remainder of his tenure. So you see, Dr. Murthy, when he was first Surgeon General under the Obama administration, this was back in 2014, he did not step into that role seeing mental health and emotional well-being as some of his top priorities. Yet the more that he traveled across the country, listening to Americans, understanding what were the dark threads that were the kind of underlying threads that had connected the reasons why we fall ill or become healthy and resilient through listening and understanding addiction, obesity, heart disease, all these most pressing public health challenges, he really saw that our relationships, our ability to have emotional and mental well-being, these were the things that were really underpinning this. So at that time, it became really clear to him, which is something that you all likely are very clear about already, that we in this country are facing a crisis of connection as well as a crisis of mental health. So this was over 8 years ago when Dr. Murthy first decided to begin this call, and now our attention and commitment to these issues have only deepened.
So, Serena, I know a lot of people have questions about, so we have this epidemic on our hands. What do we do about it? Especially for those who might be in organizations not equipped with acute care, not equipped with a lot of resources. How might they be able to address this in their own ways and context from your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'll also share that to help contextualize this question. When Dr. Murthy stepped into office, this was at the height of the pandemic in March of 2021. And we really asked ourselves what urgent priorities the COVID-19 pandemic was bringing to light that would have true long-tail impacts on our country's health and well-being. And so we brought this question to young people and asked them what was happening in their lives, what would they say were the most important priorities. And it became instantly clear in hearing from them that their mental health and their well-being was something that we really needed to center. So in addition to the direct traumas that they faced through the COVID-19 pandemic, they also experienced other profound challenges that affected their well-being, such as the social political turmoil we're experiencing, educational and family stressors, as well as concerns about climate change. So while we know that our young people, these future generations, are resilient, in fact, they have to be, these challenges that are facing them today require more than, as Josh was pointing to earlier today, more than just individual level acknowledgement, but really require an all of society effort in changing culture and practice and policy to support their health. So you asked this question, Angela, around what can faith leaders do about it? And so I'll just start off by saying that we earlier this year released a Surgeon General's advisory, which is a written product that is all about youth mental health. And the purpose of this advisory was to lay out the latest scientific information and set out some policy and action best practices for people across all different sectors of society to take action on. So there's actually an entire section within the advisory that is devoted to community leaders. And I'll just share two of the biggest areas of impact that I think faith leaders can play in this movement. The first one is to educate your community, both youth and their families, about the importance of mental health. I think on this call, we were already talking about, young people really know that this is an issue and the stigma is not as present. And so with faith leaders, I think the ability to communicate and to bring in their family and their community into this conversation is critical. Tactically, I think you can foster dialogue and create conversation spaces for family members, for community about mental health and correct some misconceptions. And something that we found to be really helpful is partnering with trusted messengers in your community, especially healthcare professionals who can really speak from that position of health authority in helping communicate why this issue is so important. So firstly is communicating and bringing in conversations around mental health needs. The second one, suggestion I would share that the advisory points to is elevating the voices of young people. Youth are obviously experts of their own lives. We all know this on this call, and it is so important to center their voices through these efforts. So tactically, things you can do are set up youth advisory councils, which I know that many of you, including Springtide, have already done, and also create peer support programs and basically just bring young people in through all phases of programming from ideation into implementation. I'll pause there. I know that I've been talking a bit. We'll turn it back to you all.
Thanks, Serena, so much for that. My internet cut out for a second, but I'm back. Those are such great, practical, tangible things. But one of the questions that I get a lot is about is this something that's going to end? Is this just a moment that sort of like the pandemic created this? And so, it's, I guess, as we get further and further away from the pandemic, then youth mental health will cease to be, like a really important issue that, maybe this will just take care of itself. In other words, if we just wait. And I think a lot of times this comes from adults who are asking this. Maybe I'm just projecting, but I sense that it comes from because, again, like they're uneasy about these conversations and they're sort of hoping that it goes away.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important question to really underline. And the bottom line is that mental health challenges in young people are real, they are widespread, and they existed before the COVID-19 pandemic and will continue to do so after if we don't take systemic and structural action. So the way that we think about it in our office is that the pandemic has been a profound trauma to our young people, and it has simply added to these pre-existing challenges that America's youth have faced. I think it's also important to highlight that the pandemic's negative impacts have most heavily impacted those who were already vulnerable to begin with, such as our low-income youth, our youth with disabilities, our youth and racial and ethnic minorities, as well as our LGBTQ+ youth. At the same time, though, Josh, the pandemic was a profound and traumatic experience for all of us, which also meant that it made people all across the board, such as parents to policymakers, recognize the importance of protecting our mental health and individuals and society. And so I'll just end this question with a case for optimism, which is that because of this newfound sense of importance and urgency and just mass awareness of this issue, I think we are at such a critical moment to really be continuing to deepen our commitment, particularly faith leaders themselves, to take action across our communities.
That's such a useful and helpful reminder, Serena. I mean, I think, even as I think through the pandemic through the lens of my own family, there's this, we have a 12-year-old at home right now. And so obviously, we were doing the whole 2 jobs and online school and all of it. I mean, we didn't experience the same level of physical trauma that a lot of people experienced with, but in terms of touching on each of those pieces, certainly, that was a part of our reality. And lately we've been thinking and talking as a family, even about how do we reshape this moment for us so that, there were some really positive things that happened, out of that experience of getting to be together. And I know that's not the case for everyone. We saw that, even on our own list of things, something like 10% of young people told us that home was not a safe place to be. And that was a really, that was stressing them out, as you can imagine, during the pandemic. But it's one of the, I think it's just really critical that we remember that there's a whole range of emotions and things that went on during the worst part of the pandemic, and it will take a long time to process those. But we have an opportunity now that we can both, like, the way that we respond to the lingering effects of that will go a long ways towards how young people see us as a resource or not. And the more that we can recognize that these trends were in place, like you said, even before the pandemic. I mean, that big study about loneliness and isolation from Cigna came out in 2016 or 2017. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was well before the pandemic. And I know that even like that concern specifically about loneliness and isolation among young people, that's been on your radar, obviously, for a while. Even your own personal work started, long before COVID did. What made that rise to, you're a member of Gen Z, but what made that sort of like rise to the top as a core concern for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, when I entered into my college experience a number of years ago, did not anticipate loneliness being something that I myself would experience in such a profound way. Actually, my first year as a freshman in my undergraduate program, I just had such a hard time making friends, adjusting to the transition. And that to me was such a humbling reminder of just how broadly and widely this experience can happen, particularly in moments of transition. Josh, at the time, I thought I was the only person on my 3,000 plus student campus to be experiencing this issue. And only upon talking about it with other students, going to faculty and advisors. Actually, my interfaith chaplain at my school was such a source of solace and comfort and guidance. Did I recognize how profoundly experienced this issue was. And this was all pre-pandemic. And so I think just now getting to have this lens, which I think so many young people have now, of just how common, how normal, how human this issue is. I think that's something that we are seeing more and more. I'll also mention that from our work at the Office of the Surgeon General, we see that there are absolutely intersections between belonging, kind of the flip side of loneliness, or healthy social connection with our mental health. And the way that we've thought about it is that cultivating healthy social connections is one of the most powerful buffers that we have to protecting the mental health of ourselves, our young people. And I think religious and spiritual communities in particular play such a critical role in helping to foster these high quality social connections. So I could go on, but I think just from everything that I think you all at Springtide have talked about, of simply learning the names of young people to giving them the tools to thrive and helping them find purpose, all of these pieces really pack together into helping to create robust social connections for young people, both in relating to themselves as well as to one another.
Yeah, it's really helpful. I mean, I love that you made that connection really explicit. You know, we've sensed that as well, that this loneliness and isolation is connected to, or belonging on the flip side of that is connected to mental health, you know, either crises or flourishing, you know, whichever side of the coin that we're looking at there. But it's so, you know, that's what we see, again, structurally in the sort of big picture view of the data. But to have people with a better sense of the micro side of this, the psychologists, counselors, psychiatrists, et cetera, who really see what this looks like in regular life. It's nice to see that that's pretty consistent across the board. Well, Serena, we'll close out here. I mean, one of my favorite things about your website is that you have this learn how to take action section. I know you've already mentioned several things that we could do like right away if we're interested in taking action on these topics, but is there anything else that you might suggest? Is like if we've got like a whole bunch of people who are going to watch this, right? I mean, what is something that they could start doing that you might suggest immediately, or a good model or a good, you know, organization out there that you might say is sort of like a place they might want to look to?
Yeah, well, there are so many tactical things that I am just kind of hoping to point you all to, that I think so many things faith leaders are already doing. And we have a website on the Office of the Surgeon General's page with extensive resources, including the advisory that I pointed out, that is all about how we support young people struggling with mental health issues and help them find flourishing. One organization in particular that I think has done an amazing job at both helping create structures of belonging, set expectations well, is a group called Iskali, which is an organization that helps and supports the formation of young Latino Catholics. And they help build a strong container of belonging, especially through kind of the teenage and the early adulthood moments of their lives. This organization offers leadership development. They offer faith-based retreats, small group containers, even financial aid for first-generation college students, and really just wraparound services for young Latino Catholics to really provide a container of support and accompaniment, and also opportunities to grow alongside their peers in this journey of formation. So I think that is an amazing group that we would love to lift up. But maybe I'll end by also putting on just a personal hat as a young person who has struggled with my own challenges of mental health over the last number of years. And it's something that I'm reminded of again as I move through my hospital chaplaincy training, which is that so many times when I'm in direct encounter with people, I have such a desire to want to help and fix and solve. And that isn't necessarily what so many of the patients that I see really are needing and wanting. And what they're needing and wanting is really just basic witnessing and helping to create this container where people feel heard and seen. It's something that I experience in the patient rooms. It's something that I see as a young person and desire in my own life. And it's something that we see at the macro level as well through the Office of the Surgeon General. And so I leave with this encouragement for faith leaders to be in the both, right? To be advocating and implementing programs and initiatives and building structures that support flourishing for young people. And when in those one-on-one spaces, in these group containers, to be creating that space of safety and witnessing. So thank you so much, Josh, and the Springtide team, and all the faith leaders that are on this call today. And please, please do consider us at the Office of the Surgeon General as resources and allies along this way.
Well, Serena, I can't thank you enough. I mean, this has been an incredibly useful chat today, and of course for all the advisory board help that you give, and just for the work that you all do at the Surgeon General's office. I'll just echo that, and really you should hopefully the audience here does see them as a resource. So thank you so much, Serena. I'll sign off here by doing a couple of things in this part, and one is to underscore, as Serena mentioned, Iskali, the ministry. It's a Christian ministry, Catholic ministry in Chicago. One of the other ones that I think about a lot in this regard is what One Table is doing in the Jewish world, of bringing people together over Shabbat dinners on Friday nights. The reason I think it's important to point out these groups is because it's helpful to know that we have in our own expressions examples of how this work, can and should be done effectively. And I think if we start digging around, we're going to see even more of them. Okay, we got to take a stretch break. We're going to go to these breakout rooms here in just a second. So you can check your email for the for your breakout room login, and those are going to start in 5 minutes. And we're also going to put up a slide where you can see the breakout rooms here that you can click on. And I just want to, if you're jumping over to the breakout rooms, that's great. You're going to be with a whole separate, there we go, there's the slide. Thank you, folks. You're going to be with a different set of hosts and with our co-hosts from different organizations. It's going to be amazing. I cannot wait for those conversations. One final note here, though, if you're a journalist, please go to the media breakout room, and we'll see you there, so that way we can have the appropriate conversation in that space. But thanks, everybody. So appreciate you being here, and more than being here, I really appreciate your dedication to all that you do for the young people in your life to support them. That's really what's critical in this moment. Thanks, everyone.